As part of a sort of will making process, we traditionally have written wills where if we're married with children, we leave everything to each other and then to the children. And that's absolutely fine, and it's certainly better than not having a will at all, much better. But what we look at really in the sort of modern world is how we might protect our assets, because what we worry about is what could happen to stop the assets getting to the children. And we're not talking about not being able to spend it. You know, we all know about skiing, spending the kids' inheritance, that's fine. But we look at how people might lose the inheritance, and you know, we look at things like, what if you were to remarry after I've gone, sort of thing. Well, there are a number of things that can then happen, that the estate can be lost to the new spouse. But let's say if I died and my wife then remarried, if she doesn't make a new will, the laws of intestacy will kick in, because any will she had is revoked by her getting remarried, you see. And the problem that will cause is that most of her assets will go to the new husband. Now, she could go bankrupt and that would stop the assets going to my children, or she could get divorced from the new husband, and because of course I left her all my assets, then they're kind of all up potentially for grabs as part of the divorce settlement. So there's all these little things, but there's also a bigger one, which is long-term care, which, you know, as most people know, if my wife later went into long-term care, they would say, what are your assets? And she says, well, I've got the house. And local authorities are going to say, well, not anymore, you haven't, and that's going to pay for your care. So all of those things would stop the assets, or a big chunk of them, going to my children, and they've been lost rather than spent.
Right.
So what we look at as what I would term estate planning really is how I can protect my assets and make sure they go to my children, but without disadvantaging my wife in any way. And that's where we use will trusts, or trust, you know, protective trusts in wills. And, you know, they can protect against all of the things. So rather than leaving perhaps my half of the house to my wife, I would leave it in trust for her. And then should any other things happen that we've talked about, it can't be deemed to be hers and can't be lost, you see. So that would be a simple explanation of that. As will writers, we generally visit people at home. And what we find is they'll open up more there, and there will be the photos on the walls, you know, and that will elicit a conversation perhaps.
Yeah.
And we'll say, oh, who's that? And, you know, if they kind of say, oh, we don't talk about him, then you know, well, you do to me, because we need to know that, do you know what I mean? And we need to get behind really the family situation. We need to know what the assets are before we can sort of look at the best options and the best ways of dealing with things. You know, when all we had to leave was enough to bury us, it didn't matter really, you know, but we're talking, you know, average house price is £150,000–160,000. That's a lot of money, you know. It may not be a lot of money if you need to buy a house, but it's a lot of money if you've got one already, you know. But the main question that gets raised with larger estates is inheritance tax.
Right.
And, you know, again, writing a will is usually the start of inheritance tax planning. It hasn't gone away, you know. The Chancellor, what was it, about 18 months ago, when he announced that he was doubling the inheritance tax allowance. He wasn't actually doubling it, but what it means for most people, they can now leave, if they're a couple, £650,000 free of inheritance tax. But what about the people who have got more than that? It hasn't gone away. And through planning, certainly starting through the will, you can start to plan to, you know, mitigate any inheritance tax quite legally, perfectly legally. The people who pay inheritance tax are the people who don't plan to avoid it. And inheritance tax has always been that way. It's been described as a voluntary tax, and most of us apparently volunteer to pay it.
So when you're looking at employing you, for instance,
Yeah.
or employing a solicitor, what's the difference? Where does the actual difference lie?
The main difference is really, firstly, a lot of solicitors' practice will tend to be of a general nature. So they will deal with most aspects of law, sort of thing. But you know, because people aren't queuing round the block to write wills, that may well mean they wouldn't write too many wills. And some people use the analogy of, if it's like going to a GP, but when it's something serious, you need to see a consultant, sort of thing. Now, certainly some solicitors do have specialist wills and probate departments, and well, I wouldn't say one is better or not. It depends what you want really. And I think the difference with a will writer is, one, that we specialise, we don't do anything else. Two, we most of us would tend to do home visits.
Right.
And generally with will writers, we tend to work on a fixed fee basis, so people know at the start how much it's going to be. so that there's no worry about the ticking clock. You know, when I sit down in people's living rooms, that's the first thing I say. You know, we don't need to look at the clock. It will take how long it takes, and we will, you know, work out what the price is going to be and tell you, sort of thing. So they tend to be the ways, and it's more that I think by taking the clock out of the equation, we get really down into the detail of how the family works and what the assets are and why people want to do the things they want to do, you know. So you know, some people will prefer a solicitor, some a will writer. Will writers tend to be a little cheaper than solicitors. Not always, it depends what job you want to do, you know. So they would be the differences, really. And so many people leave their financial affairs a bit to chance as well, you know. So they haven't got the will and they know they should. They haven't got their finances sorted out and they probably know they should do that. And because we need to look at the finances in some detail, because you can't make a will if you don't know what assets you have. That would suggest you don't have the mental capacity to make a will. We look at it in some detail, and I'll give an example. We often talk to people about, you know, what will happen if you're not here, and in light of that conversation, people will often look at what life insurance they have, and they will think, goodness, yeah, if I really wasn't here, how on earth is my spouse supposed to survive on that money? They couldn't do it. There are an awful lot of other things that can be done with regards to planning with inheritance tax. Again, it needs sound financial advice, really, and I think the point I would make is that I wouldn't say you get a free financial review when you see a will writer, but generally will writers will work with financial advisors quite closely, and there will be an easy sort of seamless link in there to sort of, at least somebody gets to have a look at your finances for you and see and tell you what you perhaps haven't done and what can be done, you know. So that can be a very important part of what we do, really.